Media that we see and read about today. So I don't want to speak longer than our keynote speaker, so I'm going to turn the mic over to our keynote speaker, Ariel Adams.
Hello. Okay, well, thanks for coming. I guess we have one thing in common. We all like watches, right? So I want to talk about a few things. There's a lot of things I can talk about. But we're here to celebrate smaller brands. I want to talk about what is a micro brand. I don't think there's a very cohesive definition of micro brand. There's all kinds of terms that get thrown around. Where did they come from? 10, 20 years ago, this phenomenon of these very small brands that have original designs and things like that, it did not exist. How do you appreciate a good micro brand from a not so good micro brand? And then maybe, is there collectability? Is this something that we should be thinking about from a collectible standpoint? Years from now, these will be something that other people want. It's not really about going up in value, but is there a future to a lot of these watches from a relevancy standpoint? I actually am against the term micro brand because I don't know how to define it. You can't use the term independent watch brand because that doesn't really narrow it down. And what I try to do is I try to focus, what do these brands have in common, and what do we appreciate? And for me, it's about a brand which is started by an enthusiast that loves watches. I work with pretty much all the brands that exist, and I can tell you that most of them are run by business people. There's nothing wrong with that, but the original person who had the idea to start the watch brand either no longer exists or is not someone you ever meet. And when you go to this room, you're talking to a lot of people that not only started the brand but love watches, and I guess the best way of evaluating a brand that fits in this category is, did the person who started the brand make the watch that they wanted to wear themselves? Are they their first customer? If they are their first customer, you're onto something. Because people that like things in a category are going to want to make one that fits their standards. This individual's probably spent a couple of years determining what's out there, what they like. They've worn a lot of watches, and in an ideal circumstance, they make a watch that fits on the wrist. I also wanted to say that I kind of like a conversational type of speech. So anytime anybody wants to say something or ask a question, just throw your hand up there, because I don't like thinking towards the end of after 30 minutes, like, what did I want to ask? Would anybody here have a different way of categorizing these types of brands? Micro brand is one of them. Does anyone feel that that sort of is a little bit limiting? Because some of these brands grow quite large. And when I started, and I'll talk about this in a second, most of these brands were run by one individual. Like a one-person brand could be a micro brand. But today, some of them have grown quite big. So any other alternative terminology that we think should be used, anyone likes? Just yell it out. Independent. Independent? Okay, but so that's a great point, right? So when I first started aBlogtoWatch in 2007, it was the independent brands that I spoke about the most, had the most access to them. But it was brands like Forward and MB&F, which tend to be like $100,000 and up. And so my question is and this is an important part of the conversation because all of us are talking about this on a regular basis. We are repeating these terms. The watch industry, especially the European watch industry, I don't know if you know, is notoriously bad at naming things. So they're not going to come up with a category. I think independent watch is just any brand that isn't owned by some type of other entity, right? So Rolex could be an independent brand, right? Does that fit into the same category as someone who just poured over designs that they made and worked with suppliers across the world? It's not the same thing, right? It's a little bit different. So that's why I agree that it is, technically speaking, an independent brand, but that's not enough. So I'm going to advocate for enthusiast-started, enthusiast-driven, enthusiast-run, but I think the term enthusiast is important. And we all have to remember something interesting. All these brands are coming out in a world which is a post-watch as a tool world. Right? There isn't a larger market out there that just needs to buy a watch to tell the time. Everyone who's into watches today likes them for an emotional reason. Once we wear them, if it's a bad tool, we'll stop wearing it. But it's not the reason we wear it in the first place. There's an emotional element. And all the people behind these brands have keyed in on that emotional element. They've discovered the pleasure that having a nice watch can give them, which is very different than this tells the time really well. And that's what a watch used to be. You had to be on time, it had to be accurate. And we look back at some of those watch ads from, I guess, the 1940s onwards. And some of them are brilliant. Anyone have seen sort of the vintage watch ads out there? I'm sure you've been online, you've seen them all. Something he wants to clap back there. These ads oftentimes would communicate something about the reliability. There's something dependable about this product. But today, when you look at a watch you like, other than the fact that you don't want it to break and have to fix it, dependability isn't really on our mind. It's actually very difficult to articulate. What is it that's on our mind when we like a watch? There's a special sort of formula. It's a mix of, is it relevant to you? Is it a color you like? Does it have a name that means something to you? There's all these emotional things that get in the process of buying a watch. And the enthusiasts that start these brands, they're not thinking about the science. They're just thinking about what appeals to me. And it's very interesting because even though they can't necessarily articulate why they like their own design, they've done something right. And if you agree with their sensibility, you will like that watch as well. So, micro-brand is a term that you can use. I find it quite limiting. I like to say enthusiast brand. These enthusiast-driven micro-brands come from. Because this is a relatively recent phenomenon, and I think it's important to talk about some of the sort of context in the larger watch industry where they exist. I think it was about maybe close to 10 years ago now, they started seeing this phenomenon of what we would call today an enthusiast-driven brand. And I think everyone needs to understand where they came from, because they did not just exist because somebody wanted it. They exist because it was possible. So 30 years ago, if you were just an individual and you had an idea for a watch design, what were you going to do? Were you going to spend millions of dollars to make a factory, to hire a bunch of engineers, to handle all the pain with distribution? Like, none of that was possible. So one of the first things that had to change in the watch industry was the ability to reach the consumer directly, and so it was the internet. So the internet was a crucial element in the growth of these brands because they all of a sudden could bypass traditional stores and distribution models and get straight to people. Look, a department store is a gatekeeper. If you have a brand, it doesn't matter if everyone in this room loves it. If Bloomingdale's doesn't, it's not going to be a Bloomingdale's. But now you don't need to ask a buyer at a department store, do you think this is cool? Will you buy 10,000 units? Now you can reach people directly who are the buyers. So that's one of the things that was crucial, is the internet. And another way the internet was crucial was it allowed people to connect with people that make watches. So an interesting thing started to happen less than 10 years ago now, is the volume of watches produced by the big brands. A Seiko, for example, would be a big brand, large volume. A lot of their manufacturing happens in Asia. And there's all these factories. There's this enormous infrastructure of factories to make cases and dials and hands and bracelets and everything you can imagine that goes into a watch. And they had, and they still have today, clients are a lot of the big brands. It's one of their secrets. If I'm dispelling it for you now, I'm sorry. But a lot of the components in watches that are Swiss watches are made in Asia. Nothing wrong with that. There's good factories and bad factories. But these factories started to have excess capacity because their orders were lowering from the traditional brands that were basically buying all of their output. So these factories are like, okay, we're set up to make watch cases and dials and hands. And our big customers, well, they're going away, or their orders are reducing, because remember, we are living in a world where a wristwatch is no longer a necessary tool. So being entrepreneurial and business-minded, as many of them are, they started to go out and say, we will offer services we've never offered before. We will private label, we will white label, we will produce your watch for you. And if you go on and you see some of the less interesting, as I'll say, micro watches, and they kind of all look the same, right? It's because it's the same factories that are making them. It requires a lot of effort and tenacity for any of these brands that want those factories to do something unique. They have to push very, very hard. But it wasn't until the internet allowed these individuals to connect with these manufacturers, and these manufacturers had this excess capacity, was there even the ability for these brands to get those orders. Because between a 10,000 unit order for a big brand and 100 pieces for a small one, as a factory, what are you going to put your time and effort into? The larger volume. And so the ability for these factories to accept smaller volume projects was crucial to this entire industry even being able to offer these brands that make a few dozen or maybe a few hundred watches per year. It simply wasn't possible. Another thing which is interesting, I think, is the ability for more and more watch lovers who are collectors to say, I now have the confidence to produce a product. I think I can do it better. And a story I hear time and time again is, I was a watch collector. I liked watches. I went through the gamut. I had all the Rolexes, the Pateks, the Audemars Piguets. I had tourbillons. I had vintage watches. I had new watches. Finally, I got so bored of everything I could buy, I had confidence enough in my own taste to produce a watch I wanted. And that's actually how the very expensive independent brand started. The Erworks and what you will of the day began as a function of why aren't there crazier, more modern watches out there? Not everybody wants something which looks like it was designed for yesterday. We want things that are designed for today. So there's a certain amount of confidence that needed to happen on behalf of the artist, the person who is actually behind it. And the mentality of these individuals varies greatly. You have people that are traditional watchmakers. You have people that have a design background. You have people that just like nice stuff. And the fact that there's multiple people with different types of backgrounds who have been able to find this available manufacturing means that the market has such a diverse amount of these small brands, these enthusiast brands. Now, I'm someone who has spent way too much time researching watches, and I know that not everyone can do that. I used to be completely glued to eBay. I remember when I was in law school, it was the first time I was in this educational environment where we're allowed to have our computers in class. I wasn't used to that, and the internet, and I couldn't help but just sit there and read about watches while I was in class. I passed all my classes, it was fine, but I spent inordinate amount of time just reading about watches, researching things. And that allowed me to very easily try to come up with criteria of what is an interesting brand and what is not an interesting brand. And what I noticed today is that the more and more brands that come out there, the more confused a lot of people are about who to pay attention to. Because it's very difficult to have seen all those watches yourself, and there's a lot of hype. Does everyone here agree that the internet has a lot of unsubstantiated hype? Yeah? There's an awful lot of that going on?
It's an understatement.
It's an understatement, sure.
Let me ask, Matt, I'm going to jump here. So the question is, how do we see through all the marketing hype of watches that we're told sold out within minutes? How is that possible?
So if you're a company and you're selling something and you sell something out really quick, that means that you're in demand and you're really hot. And if you're able to do that successfully, that's fantastic. The problem is that I see a lot of products being sold out quickly that have no ability to verify that they are actually doing that. And so I very quickly developed a filter, and if I can't independently substantiate information on the internet, well, frankly, I don't believe it. People will co-opt others to say, this is the best thing, or this is the greatest thing, or you have to check this out. We want to believe what we read, especially what we feel is published by peers and friends and colleagues and people that feel the same way we do. But one of the strange things about the internet, especially on social media, is you're not paid in money most of the time. You're paid in ego, right? You're paid in likes, and you're paid in followers, and it's very much about the person publishing. And as the recipient of this information, the follower, if you will, it's not really for you. You spend money on cable TV, for example. They know who the customer is. It's the person paying. On social media, it's the person posting, essentially, who is the customer. So if you see information online about something that is not able to be substantiated, and you can't really determine why the person is publishing the information, I just outright ignore it. You know, going back to law school, I learned something very valuable, which is the rules of evidence, which is not something most people care about, but it's things that are allowed in court, right? And there's this notion of hearsay, which is an out-of-court statement brought in to substantiate something which is not allowed unless that person who said it is there. So I don't really believe what anyone says. I'm sort of chronically skeptical of everything, which has allowed me to make decisions for myself. And I guess what I should say to everyone is, don't believe a single thing you read that's an opinion. Determine facts, and make a decision for yourself. Now that's hard to do, right? Because there's hundreds of watches that come out every single year. I did an analysis one time, and I determined the average person out there that spends any time on social media is offered something like 30 watches to buy a week. I don't know about you, but I can't afford to buy 30 watches a week, nor do I have the interest in buying 30 watches a week. So the good thing is that you, as someone that likes watches, are in a position to be super, super picky. But you also need to be careful. And you also need to look for yourself. See these watches. That's why I like events like this. It's an opportunity to not only see watches, but to see watches on other people's wrists. See what they look like. You know, it's kind of like if you're trying to evaluate, like, does a new pair of shoes look cool? Well, if I can't wear it, does it look cool on him? Yeah? Okay, I can see myself wearing that. That's a really important way to determine if you like the watch. And the last thing I'll say about this sort of answer this question, how do you determine the hype? Go with your own taste. There's watches out there for everyone. I actually like it when someone says that a watch I like is ugly, because I'm like, great, the world needs variety. If you think it's ugly, I probably think something you have is ugly. You can't argue taste. I mean, I don't know how many times I can say it. You cannot argue taste. There's fundamental things like, can you read the time? Well, no one can argue that. That's a functional element of a watch that is unarguable. You either can or can't read it. When it comes to taste, it comes to color. Don't try to get something that you think other people will approve or they like. There is no one pretty watch. There's a pretty watch for you. Wearing a watch should be a very selfish experience. Which leads me to the discussion point of how do we determine which of these brands are worth our time and attention? Well, these brands, especially the ones that show here, fall into two major categories for me, only one of which I'm currently interested in now as a collector. The one that I'm not so interested in is, I want to sample a design that if I wanted to buy the real thing was a lot more expensive. Now, when I started out being a collector, I was purchasing all kinds of designs from, I'll call them homage watches, right? You see the Rolex Submariner. You know, it's about a $9,000 watch, depending on which version you get. I guess what price you get it at too, right? That's a big investment. Why not wear something that kind of looks a little bit like that to sample the waters? So a lot of these brands can be very valuable when sampling a design that you're not necessarily sure if you'll want. It's a good thing for that. But you know what? I'm kind of over that because I personally get to handle everything. I don't need to sample anymore. But of course, not everyone is in that position. But the watch brands that I am interested in, and this is what I look for in any small brand coming out, is originality. Are there original design elements? Are there original technical elements? Are there original materials? What's original about the watch that I'm seeing? Now this is hard to do. You need exposure. You need to look at tons and tons and tons of watches to know it's original, because some of these guys will be sneaky. They'll copy something that is obscure, and then they won't tell anyone, well, we homage this. And there's a lot of that going on, and that's actually how the fashion watch came about. Everyone heard the term fashion watch? What a fashion watch actually is, and it was Fossil actually that created the fashion watch. So the modern fashion watch, as you know, was created by Fossil 35 years ago. And what they did is they literally went to the market and they said, what are all the fancy high-end watches, the designer watches? How can we make more pedestrian versions of that? So Fossil actually pioneered and did very well the fashion watch by saying kind of a look-alike, we're borrowing design elements for the mainstream. So the notion of a fashion watch isn't anything new, but I think that when you are wanting to invest in an artistic watch, someone said the word artist here. Do you want to buy art by an artist who's copying someone else's aesthetic? Probably not. When I buy art, or I'm interested in art, I'm looking, what does this particular artist bring to the table that is original? What are they doing that no one else does? And when I wear a watch from any of these brands, even if I don't immediately like it, I'm interested in where the originality is. Now, it's not easy to be original in watches. You know, the wristwatch as we know it has been around for more than 100 years, and in the mid-20th century, the amount of product diversity was vast. Has anyone been to the Patek Philippe Museum in Geneva? Okay, a couple of arms raised. What's that?
They had it in New York.
The exhibition, you're right.
On 42nd Street.
I went to that Cipriani?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was there too. So they brought some of the pieces there, but not everything. One of the things that amazes me is the amount of diversity that Patek Philippe was experimenting with between the 20s and the 40s. Like every conceivable design combination they've done. And they're just one brand. So you see a lot of stuff that appears new today. Go to the Patek Philippe Museum, and they did one in like 1927. Seriously. The ability to be original today in watches is really not about shapes, right? It's about pricing. It's also about materials. For me, that's the most exciting thing today when it comes to these independent brands, and the big brands for that matter. If they have access to manufacturing techniques and materials that were wholly unavailable. Wholly unavailable. So for example, I'm wearing a watch that's yellow. A lot of people know any yellow watches? Probably not. There's almost none that exist. I wanted a yellow watch, and the way that I was able to achieve it with Undone in making this was using a coating called Cerakote. You cannot get yellow ceramic to be stable. You don't want to make a plastic one. Carbon will look like crap, right? So there's these new abilities to pioneer in things like making a yellow watch. There's no material out there. Someone will figure it out eventually. But these are the areas where the actual innovation is happening. They might seem simple like color, but they really changed the game. So when looking at independent brands, especially when it comes to materials, see where people are borrowing from other industries, bringing interesting types of know-how, interesting materials. Richard Mille does it very well. They charge an awful lot for it. But look at what they were able to do with carbon, okay? A very unluxurious material that they were able to get $1 million for in a lot of instances. But this is a material that has a lot of benefits to it, but it's not metal. And so many of us are stuck in the mindset of a metal watch, a metal watch. In fact, the popularity of gold watches was not because of the fact that it was a precious metal. It was because gold doesn't tarnish. And prior to having stainless steel, you would use gold in order to make a case material because it didn't look terrible, especially if there was water. Stainless steel, actually, from a functional standpoint, made gold watches irrelevant. They just became a status symbol. Okay, so finally, let's talk about collectability. I'm a watch collector. I don't collect watches for them to increase in value, but I think that we want to future-proof ourselves, right? We want to purchase something that we will like and maybe someone else will like in the future. We all have this sort of vague notion that our collections are going to be valuable someday, right? How great would that be? Will we have something that we didn't think too much about and all of a sudden somebody wants to spend a whole lot of money on it? Wouldn't that be nice? So a lot of the watches that are in the sort of micro-brand, enthusiast-driven category are a lot less expensive, and they come and they go quite quickly. It's very difficult to think of them as being collectible, especially since the aftermarket for them, in most cases, doesn't really exist yet. And the reason it doesn't exist yet is these brands are so prolific, there's so much new stuff coming all the time, very rarely do you have an opportunity to go back and be like, I remember that one that came out a year ago. So I actually want to ask a question to everyone here. On the, I'll just say $2,000 and under level, what is anyone seeing that they think to themselves, I'd like to collect that, I'd like to get more of those? Any ideas?
Like an Oris Aquis, first generation.
A first generation Oris Aquis.
Yes.
And tell me why you think that has a potential of collectability.
I'd say the aesthetics, obviously some of the specs. So, water resistance specs. I think to some degree there's originality. It's not merely an homage piece. It doesn't look like a Submariner. I mean, to the extent that every diamond doesn't look like a Submariner. It's a, despite the fact that it uses can movement, right? Salida, SW200. I would say that there's enough that it's nuanced. You've got your red rotor, so you've got a modification to even the can movement. And the bracelet, of course, is both a blessing and a curse, right? Because you can't just use any aftermarket band to replace it, but it's also unique in that regard.
Thank you to our resident Oris expert. When a brand begins to invest in a product line, Meaning they don't just make one, but they make generation after generation after generation. This is when collectors start to take notice. Because collecting from other people also want this perspective is about awareness, but it's also about buying a certain degree of DNA from a brand. So the first generation Aquas never would have been an interesting watch if it stayed at a first generation watch. Same thing with Casio. If they just made one G-Shock for a few years and that was that, no one cares. But what you're both pointing at are watches, the G-Shock of course more, are becoming institutions unto themselves. So any of these brands has the ability to create something which is an institution unto itself. We just don't know that yet, right? We have the benefit of hindsight with something like a G-Shock, because you look back and you're like, there is a collector market. And there is actually a very real G-Shock collector's market. And so what I want to say about the brands here is there's two types of things that I would find collectible. Well, I guess three if you just want to say that really nice watch that just happened to be fantastic. Watches where the brand continues, like I said, to invest in that product line. They come out with new ones, they do little evolutions, they start to improve them. We have a sense of nostalgia for childhood. And a watch in its childhood phase is always going to be more interesting. But we never are able to appreciate that until the watch becomes an adult, right? Also, there are interesting problems that can be solved that we're talking over the first time. So the first yellow watch, the first all blue watch. So these are very superficial types of things. But as a collector, if you notice that someone has solved a problem or done something for the first time, that might be an interesting thing to think about collecting. But it is a moving target, and I would advise against anyone thinking about this or any watches as an investment, right? You buy these because you like them. The best way for me to connect with any of these brands, and that's why I like the ones that are enthusiast-driven, is I can speak to the man or the woman behind the brand, and I can gauge them. You know, I can test them. I can ask them questions. Do you really like watches? Do you really know what went into your watch? The more that person is enthused about it, the more I become enthused about it. And that's an emotion that translates very well with the enthusiast-driven brands, but becomes more challenging when the separation between the person making the watches and the person buying it increases. So certain brands here that do well will have the discipline to stay small, and other brands will, of course, want to grow. And there are many brands I've seen start at the Kickstarter level, so to say, and grow up to be very large or larger. And there's ones that are totally okay, subsisting at a moderate amount of production per year because they can keep quality high and they can continue to produce something that they like. And that is, if you will, the life cycle of many of these brands. They stay how they are, or they grow big, or they go away. And you need to be okay with the fact that these brands are going to come and go. What do they say about business, like restaurant world? Something like 80% fail and 20% succeed. It's probably very similar here with watches. And this is nothing new. Just because you see these micro brands here for the first time and they're sold and marketed direct to consumer, if you look back at vintage watches, there's so many brands out there that came and went. I get all the time, I get emails from people like, what's this watch? I can't find anything about it. Some watch that was made for 5 years between 1965 and like 1970. No one's ever heard of it. It was built by someone else. But watches like that, if you look back, because it was such a small time frame, nobody knows them. Therefore, how can you collect something that nobody knows about? You have to be that super obscure type of customer. So we talked about what independent watches, micro watches, enthusiast-driven brands are. And the reason I really wanted to talk about that is all of you are ambassadors of this hobby. You all speak to your friends, you all speak to your colleagues, and of course, other people that like watches. And I'm big on terminology. I just want to make sure that we are categorizing this type of segment properly. Because the big brands are watching, and the big marketers are watching, and trust me, all of a sudden, there'll be somebody creating a micro brand with a giant corporate parent. In fact, I already know that it happens. Some of these micro brands have secret parents that they don't necessarily want to advertise so well, but they do them as experiments. And it's actually quite interesting when I hear about it. Some of these brands are experiments by big brands just to see what will happen. None of them are here, but these brands do exist, And they are definite experiments. So I think it's important because, again, this category was created by enthusiasts, is funded by enthusiasts, and is for enthusiasts. And the enthusiasts have a responsibility to themselves to communicate about this topic in the right way. The feedback that the community gives and the way they talk about it helps fund what the next generation is. And I'm just curious, is there any hopes of what the next generation of micro-brand is? Where do people want to see this category evolve to? I'm curious. I know it's a hard question.
You mean as a consumer or as a business proposition?
Well, as a consumer, sure, you'd be buying whatever the next generation is. What do you want to buy? Where do you want to see the? You want to see more marketing? You want to see brand ambassadors? You want to see a bunch of celebrities?
No, you want to see more diversity in design.
More diversity in design? So more originality is what you're saying.
Well, as a consumer, you want choice. You want to get an opportunity to see lots of interesting things. You want to see consumer, not purely for pleasure, as opposed to an investor. Because an investor, if you want to invest, you want to buy the one that's going to be the next big thing, right? Based on your logic. But if you are a consumer who's doing it, then you want to see variety of different kinds of watches in terms of style, maybe even throwbacks or homages to watch designs that no longer exist, but maybe be on a purely aesthetic level really cool.
Okay, so
Now it seemed to me you want diversity as a consumer.
there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just interested.
I would say passing on greater value to the consumer. Your example was a good one about celebrity endorsements, which obviously is going to increase the overhead multiple times. So I'd rather see, of course, these brands pass that on to their innovations, their new designs, and their everything from durability, and again, raising the bar as to their specs for these watches. If it all
So you want prices to stay at a reasonable level. Look, that's a very, very important thing to communicate, because the natural trajectory of brands is to increase the price. We're popular now, we have more of an ability to make more interesting things, let's increase the price. If there's a price point, I'll just say $1,000 for example, and that's what you want to be spending, it's quite important to say, you know what, I'm interested in the $1,000 level. Stay at that level. And moving forward, I promise you, a better way of categorizing these brands is not going to be independent micro-enthusiasts. It's going to be a function of two things: the price points and the annual volume. The annual volume is really, really important, as well as the price point. These are the ways that you can determine maybe how much interest you have as a brand. Because a watch that costs $1,000, they only make 1,000 of them a year, is inherently more interesting and valuable than a watch that costs $1,000 that they make 100,000 of a year, at least to me. So looking not only at price, but annual production is important. Does anyone else agree about annual production? I want these things to stay a little bit boutique-y, right? I don't want everyone to have them. I mean, I kind of want everyone to have them, but not the same thing. What else? How else do we want to see this move?
I'd say being able to meet and talk with the founders and hear, how they came up with their idea for a company, what watches they're thinking about. You don't really get to do that with an Omega or Rolex, or at least hear someone like you interview them. And they're a tiny little company, and you can track them much more easily than 30 different types of watches that an Omega.
So I totally agree with you, but when you hear these individuals that create these brands, a little more specifically, what do you want to hear from them? I mean, their life story is one thing. Why they came up with the watches tends to be the same story. Well, I like watches, so I wanted to have one myself. But do you want to know about the other things they like? Their design inspiration?
Design inspiration is something I see on some of the smaller brands. Oh, it's a microphone. That's dangerous. Particularly imitations of Arnold. There was one brand that I saw that the watch dial was just completely unique, and it reminded me of like a look into the stars. And when I mentioned that to him, he said, well, I really didn't think about it, but then we started talking about science fiction shows like The Expanse. Turns out we're both tremendous fans of the same show. So there's that part of it. There's also the part of, is it a quality product? It might feel good. You have 316L stainless, but are the parts on the dial going to be falling off in 2 years? If I spend $1,000 on this watch, 5 years from now, it better still be working.
You brought up an interesting point about science fiction, right? And finding other things you find in common. I think, and this is where I'll sort of end, and this is sort of the part that makes me smile the most, is people like to enjoy watches with their friends, and they also like to buy watches from people that seem friendly, and friends tend to like the same things you do. And it's very true that when you see a watch in the complete design, it's very difficult to determine what was someone inspired by. But if they were inspired by something that you also like, all of a sudden, you're automatically more interested in the product. Which is, actually I had an experiment. So this watch right here, the Laco one, I worked on this as an experiment. And I don't get to as much as I feel like I would like to, but I have a history playing video games. And I thought to myself, why not design a watch to fit within the Fallout game universe? What if I made a watch that the main character in the game would be wearing? I mean, this is a fantasy universe, but let's try to make a real watch for a fantasy universe. Because I thought if there's someone else out there who also enjoyed this universe, they'd be like, oh, that's cool. Now I see where it fits in. There's something about seeing a watch, how it fits in to the imagination of the creator, which makes it so much more impactful.
That's actually something I was also thinking about, wanted to add as a criteria from my point of view. Is I think watchmakers need to think about how they can effectively use the real estate we give them, right? Not only for telling time, but also to go beyond a representation of the global supply chain, right? To your point. I think we're 10 years in now, but still a lot of those watches look like a representation of the global supply chain. And I would rather have something that looks like art or something that I can look at.
Look, we're all wearing art on the wrist. Whether or not we want to admit it, we are all wearing art on the wrist. Okay, that's all I got. Any other questions? Well, I'm here for a few more hours, so thank you for listening.
Where's the green sub today?
The green sub? I only got 2 wrists, man. I only got 2. Yeah, grow me some more wrists, I'll wear the green sub.
Fair enough.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you, Ariel.